Folks, today at the White House, Donald Trump signed an executive order that he said will encourage police departments to adopt higher standards related to the use of force and de-escalating training. Here's what he said.
Today is about pursuing common sense and fighting for a cause like we seldom get the chance to fight for. We have to find common ground. But I strongly oppose the radical and dangerous efforts to defend, dismantle, and dissolve our police departments, especially now when we've achieved the lowest recorded crime rates in recent history. Americans know the truth. Without police,
Come on. I can't keep listening to that bullshit. Here's the real deal, folks. A lot of stuff he was lying in this whole presentation. He lied when he said that previous presidents like Obama and Biden did not try to do anything when it came to policing. That was a flat out lie. In fact, they put in a lot of procedures and practices and rules that Trump rolled back. So I can't get excited because you're actually trying to say you're doing something. The other piece here, when what they laid out is, of course, they had all of these different police officers there, these police unions touting with the creation of this database, attract these officers. Here's the problem. Who's going to pay for it? There's no funding in the executive order. So earlier he also met with families, victims, both from Jean, Ahmaud Arbery's family, and others. Lee Merritt, the attorney, yesterday, Jeff Bennett of NBC reported that Merritt was going to be speaking today at the Rose Garden. He was supposed to speak, but right now, though, first of all, he's actually in that hearing taking place before Congress. Now, but one of the things that Lee Merritt, what he did was he put this tweet here out, actually speaking to that, which was taken by some people to be very critical. This is what he tweeted. Reports of a photo op with the president or standing with the White House during the EO signing are false. Show me the civil rights leaders who are upset about families making a direct appeal for federal intervention after the murder of their loved ones, and I'll show you a clown. Well, the reality is Lee Merritt was supposed to be there. He was going to speak. He opted today not to. Civil rights leaders were also critical of him speaking and also being there with Donald Trump. I want to go to my panel. Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Cheryl Dorsey, retired LAPD Sergeant. Dr. Cleo Monago is a political analyst. Cheryl, I want to start with you. Again, this is my perspective. Donald Trump's down in all polls. CNN had him down 14 points. Rasmussen, his favorite poll, had him down 12 points. He's losing independents, white women all across the country. Look at the numbers right now. He's tied with Biden in Texas. He's only up 2 in Arkansas, a state he won by 27 points. He's tied in North Carolina. He's down in other places. Today was all political theater to show he actually wants to do something about police reform because he sees how it's killing his reelection chances.
Well, the problem with all of that is that he was being disingenuous and intellectually dishonest in the reforms that he's putting forth. Listen, nothing that he said today is going to change what patrol officers do day to day, and I know this to be true because I was one for 20 years. And so if you ban a chokehold like they're proposing, okay, we saw Daniel Pantaleo use a prohibited chokehold, a banned chokehold in the murder of Eric Garner, and what did the New York commissioner tell us? That wasn't a chokehold. That was an upper body seatbelt restraint. So banning a chokehold and giving it another name, thereby making it not the thing that it is just intellectually dishonest. If you look at when officers can use deadly force, we've always been able to use it as a last resort rather than a first resort. If you have officers who say that they were in fear for their safety or they thought they were in immediate defense of their life when they shot a man in the back, it's very difficult to argue what's in someone's head. And so all of this really means nothing. And so I'm really disheartened that folks would be so easily led or misled in that the things that they're proposing pretty much already exist, and the things that don't exist are not going to change police officers day to day. What I want to hear them say is accountability. You would think it was a 4-letter word, something that they can't say. When a police officer shows up to roll call and 2 or 3 of their partners are not in roll call in their seat because they're facing federal charges or murder charges, police officers will start to do something different. But if you don't hold them accountable, how do you have a guy who's got 18 personnel complaints? You think Derek Chauvin wasn't on a list? We need another one, a national database. Now we know that Rolfe had a dozen personnel complaints. He was on a list. So just having an officer on a list is not going to stop them from killing us. And what about those 7 officers who just quit over in Minneapolis and can now go to another police department who's more in line with their thinking and would continue to kill, but under a different name, wearing a different uniform? There's a Mississippi police chief who saw nothing wrong with the murder of George Floyd. There's a major on the Tulsa Police Department who says more blacks should be shot. And so there's a place for those officers. 57 walked off New York, Buffalo, New York, ERT. 57 SWAT members in Hollandale, Florida, walked off because they were pissed off. Their leader, their chief, took a knee. It's the mindset, it's the culture. And until you address that, we're going to continue to have this problem.
Cleo, you work with law enforcement there in Los Angeles County. All these people, let's praise Trump. Let's give him credit. This executive order, Cheryl was on CNN earlier, and Van Jones and former Chief Charles Ramsey said, now we have a new floor, if you will. I'm not buying it, because the reality is, I don't believe the Republicans are going to have a serious bill that's tougher than the Democrats' bill, which many say should be even stronger as well.
Well, Roland, I have to say to start that I usually don't watch those videos anymore because it's numbingly painful and it's just sad. So I'm still tripping off the imagery of Dre and knowing that young brother was going to be murdered any moment. So part of my emotionality, but I'm still there. I think we all expect at this point for Donald Trump to perform and say crazy stuff and to lie, because, as I've said before, it works. People who support him are not concerned about Black life. They're not concerned about police brutality. I think the sister just broke down a litany of crazy cops, which makes me reiterate the fact that this is not simply a bunch of, or a small group of bad apples. As the sister also said, this is a culture. And I just hope that today's allegedly heightened concern around Black people being murdered, inspired supposedly by George Floyd, does create change. And the reason I say supposedly by George Floyd, because in my opinion, there were some gory deaths that preceded him that didn't result in the kind of a so-called outcry that we're dealing with now, which I still believe is mostly because of the COVID-19 social restrictions, and all those things are one of the elements here. But yeah, I mean, of course, Trump was lying. He's always lying. I mean, what's next? Bottom line is we need to change the system, and Black people need to hold folks accountable. Vote.
Dayvon, I can't get excited about an executive order because it's not law. And the bottom line is this here. I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, great. I mean, it's good. It's unbelievable. No, I am not. Because the reality is what Donald Trump did today was all about trying to score some cheap political points. He can walk it back on Twitter anytime he wants to. It's a different deal when you sign a bill into law and then you're going to have changes. This executive order, they can slow walk it. They can ignore it. And again, you create a database. Who gives a damn when you don't even say how the database is going to be funded, Dayvon?
So, exactly. I mean, I think an executive order is typically a president's way of signaling to policy that they don't have the power to enact. And I think it's really important that the issue of police brutality, when we're talking about like the legislative reforms that is necessary, there's a metric that all policy should be filtered through, which is, does this policy undermine the authority that police are given to police themselves? And to the extent that that is undermined is the extent to which a legislative action should be understood to be helpful to that end. One other thing I want to add, because, I watched the speech that Trump gave. And as you and your other guests have mentioned, he speaks in dog whistle. Right. He's a PR marketing person to his base. And there was something really important in what he said that I think we have to push back on. And what that is that he talked about the importance of law enforcement in addressing public safety, right? And it's actually one of the things that I think, folks on, so-called left or people who call themselves radicals, I think don't address that issue to the extent necessary to really talk to our base, like talk to our people. And I think one of the things that Trump is doing is that he's signaling to people who may not be as, politically inclined or people who pay as much attention to policy.
Right.
And when he talks about the importance of public safety, what we have to push back on is to say that the version of public safety that Trump, the FOP, and other kinds of entities are pushing actually does not make us safer.
And is actually different from Noble. And again, they're not even listening to black law enforcement officials. I want to wrap all this into this, also this as well. Cheryl, yesterday, the LA County Sheriff came out and said that the hanging of Robert Fuller, 24-year-old in Palmdale, California, now is being investigated as a homicide. But they rushed out and called it a suicide. In Houston, a man was found hanging from a tree overnight. Detectives responded to what, again, they call an apparent suicide near the Houston neighborhood of Shady Acres after video from the scene was circulated online throughout the day. Those who shared the video compared the death to that of two other recent hangings, including Fuller. Now, Houston police later confirmed the man found hanging is Hispanic and his family said he was suicidal. Police Chief Art Acevedo confirmed that there were not sounds of foul play. We've gotten reports of a hanging in Atlanta and two others, a total of 5 here. The thing here, Cheryl, that people are saying is, if you're the police, why do you immediately rush out and say, oh, suicide, as opposed to do an investigation so public can actually trust the investigation? The folks in LA County look like some damn fools today.
I think part of the problem is that some of what they say, and listen, police chiefs are used to speaking publicly, and I think they're very savvy, and I think a lot of times what they say is for prospective jurors down the road, if this thing ever goes to court. I think a lot of it is to try to dirty up the victim. In most cases, in the minds of the public, we hear them say, Mr. Floyd was trying to pass a counterfeit bill. We don't even know if he knew that the bill was counterfeit. We've heard that Mr. Brooks was driving under the influence. I don't know if he was driving under the influence, and so on and so on. And so I think it's an attempt to mitigate the bad behavior, to portray this person in a way that somehow they deserved this thing. They weren't compliant. He took the officer's taser. Whatever it is that they want to say, I think is an attempt to dirty the victim up and put in the minds of the community. And, because they never come back and unring that bell. You can't unhear it once you've heard it, right? It's out there. And I don't think that they are naive when they do it. I think it's a concerted effort in most cases.
And Cleo, that's one of the things that I keep saying, it boils down to trust. When we see example after example after example of police officers lying on reports, lying in their testimony, and all of a sudden you want us to actually believe when they say, oh, this happened, we're all good.
Well, up until very recently, the lies have worked. I mean, in every single case where a black person has been murdered and the cops were on trial, if they went to trial at all, they lie. So that's a norm. In previous years, up until recently, the lies have worked. I think it's important to reiterate that the reason why these hangings, if you will, or so-called suicides, which I don't think they are called suicides, is because the police department is always deflecting any thought of that it might be race-related. Even when it's race-related, they make sure that they call themselves getting to the point of erasing that idea as quick as possible, because the police departments are full of racism. I've seen with my own eyes, and and being anti-black and abusive of black people is a norm. It's games for a lot of these people, and they've never had to worry about it. So that's one of the reasons why they constantly jump to a conclusion that's not race-related when something like a hanging is located. But of course, we're going to have to deal with lies, because if it wasn't for lies, these people would have have lost their jobs. So lying about crimes is a norm. And my concern sometimes, though, is that when black people who are a part of some of these races show up, sometimes like in Walter Scott's case, and in Sandra Bland's case, they show up and co-write a fictitious report to make sure that everybody gets off. So he needs to take a look at our behavior
Right.
and how some of us feed into white supremacist treachery and murder.
Dayvon, one of the issues that we're dealing with here when we talk about trying to create this change and trying to get true police reform is that we also are fighting this mental block that I believe people have with holding police accountable. I have great respect for Congressman Jim Clyburn, but I think he is absolutely wrong on the issue of defund the police, because he's buying into what somebody else's narrative is as opposed to, no, let's stop pouring millions and millions of dollars into the exact same thing that's not working. Defund the police does not say, hey, we want to wipe all police officers off the map. No, what it's saying is we simply don't want to keep pouring money into the existing system. Let's have mental health people respond to a mental health crisis. When you get a phone call and it's a mental health crisis, a police officer should not be showing up without a mental health expert with them. That's what people are saying, and I think part of the problem here is that you have all these Republicans, of course, line up against it, but you have Democrats who don't understand what people like you and others are saying when they say we've got to. They went, well, why can't you just call it reform the police? Because that's also not the same. Go ahead.
So a few points that are important. The first is that in a place like Baltimore, where out of about a $3 billion budget, the city spent over $500 million on policing. So look at it just from purely a customer service perspective. You're spending $500 million on something that has not been effective, right? So that's one piece. So what that should do is it should cause us then to think about what are the mechanisms of public safety that are alternatives that are, one, more cost effective, but just generally more effective. One of the things that, the great John Henry Clark once said is that there's societies that don't have a word for jail because they didn't have it. And I think a part of the problem with living in Western civilization is that many of us can't imagine a world, without police, without prisons. And to your point, this isn't to say that we abolish all those things right now, because the most important thing about the question of defunding is the importance of building those alternative community safety, the alternative infrastructure that is necessary to facilitate community safety, right? You mentioned the example of like a mental health professional, right? I think that includes, networks that exist indigenously within our communities, right? That can be more proactive in addressing conflicts. And in fact, those who have been involved in addressing conflicts without the police, right, have used the networks within the community as a resource to figure out how to resolve conflicts that lead to violence. So I think when we talk about defunding police, part of the problem is that people just conceptually, to your point about this mental block, people have conceptually wed themselves to a vision of the world that requires the existence of police. And a part of what we're saying is we're saying two things. One is, what are the kinds of reforms that can get us closer to a world where we can eventually abolish police, right? And we have to have the imagination to be able to think that such a world can exist. And I think that requires people to study non-Western civilizations that, again, don't have police. But what it also requires is for us to look at the actual ways in which public safety is carried out,
Right.
and look at what are different ways to do it.
Cheryl, real quick.
Uh-huh.
Hold on, Cleo, real quick. Go ahead.
You used the term earlier that the system is not working. And I think it's important that we understand that there's...
No, the system is not working for us, but it's working exactly how it was designed against us.
That was the point I was getting ready to make, that the system is working for people who are racist, anti-Black, and into controlling Black populations and destroying Black lives when they get the opportunity. And that's why, because it's a culture that is working and has worked for many decades at least, when there's a pushback, people go into lie in fantasy mode, into this disorienting dilemma, because the culture is being pushed back. But the culture has worked just fine for people who believe that our lives don't have that much value and that we're just playthings to kill at the whim of certain people.
Cheryl, the thing is this here. I didn't hear anybody today at this executive order talk about qualified immunity. And the reality is, as long as a lot of these police officers know they can act a fool and I'm good, my pension is fine, the city, y'all can pay y'all can pay those lawsuits, I'm just going to keep doing what I do.
Absolutely, and that's part of the accountability that I speak of, because there's no specificity. In addition to dealing with qualified immunity, the police officer's Bill of Rights, officers are given a certification in order to be a cop, post police officer standard and training. Imagine, if you will, if you were to go out and get 3 speeding tickets in a month, or God forbid, you get in your car and decide every day you're going to engage in vehicular manslaughter, DMV would take your driver's license, right? How is it then that a police officer who has racked up 18 personnel complaints, a dozen personnel complaints, involved in uses of force, deadly force, continues to be certified, continues to have that license, given the gift of resignation, not terminated when they do commit a murder, like Betty Shelby, who was given the gift of resignation and went over to a neighboring police department, like Timothy Loman, who was given the gift of resignation and left Independence Police Department and went over to Cleveland. How about we take those officers post-certification so that they can't go from department to department to department? Wouldn't that be helpful? Wouldn't that be meaningful? But, you know, they talk a good game, but when it comes to actually putting teeth behind reform that will rein in errant officers, they don't. And so if you don't deter the bad behavior, why would I, if I have 18 personnel complaints, why would I do anything differently? Had they dealt with Derek Chauvin at 6 or 7 or 12, Mr. Floyd would be here today.
There you go.
Hey, Roland, can I add one thing?
Dayvon, I got about 20 seconds. Go.
So I think one hard conversation we're going to have is the role of labor, because a big part of what law enforcement hides behind is the collective bargaining. And so it's going to be important for labor to come together to be able to say, to do things like take folks' pension.
Right.
Or be able to do things to say, you know, like those. And that's a hard conversation that labor is going to have to really demonstrate their solidarity with Black folks on this issue.
Dayvon Love, Cheryl Dorsey, Cleo Monago. Certainly appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right, folks, got to go to the break. When we come back, crazy as white people losing their jobs by confronting Black and brown people. I keep telling y'all, please go right ahead. You can solve Black unemployment all yourselves. We'll be back on Roland Martin Unfiltered.